Hello, everyone. I can see the attendance list increase in numbers, so we're going to give it just a few seconds for everyone to log in, and then we're going to start this great webinar in a second. So you can see in the meantime on the screen the event schedule. We are hoping to have enough time at the end to have a very nice discussion with everyone, where we'll be very happy to pick up any question and answer them. Okay.
Asking, will we get a copy of the slide?
We will be sharing a copy of the slides, and we'll also be sharing the recording after the event has finished. Brilliant. Okay, so I'm gonna stop sharing the screen so that we can give you a quick introduction. Okay, so hello and welcome everyone. Thank you for joining us on this exciting, I hope, webinar. My name is Tiziana Scamma, and I will be hosting today's webinar. We are excited to explore this important topic and share valuable insight with you today. Before we begin, just a quick housekeeping note. So to ensure the best audio experience, all microphones have been muted. If you have any question, please submit using the question and answer link that you should find at the top of the screen. We will try to answer your question during the question and answer period time after each talk, or if that is not possible because of time, we'll cover them also during the forum at the end of this webinar. We encourage you to participate because your questions are very important and we want them to be part of the discussion. So if we don't get to cover all the questions that are going to be in the question and answer session, we will try to follow up later on after the webinar so that we'll be able to answer all of them. We have an engaging session ahead of us here, and we will be sharing directly information and experience directly from industry experts about how the sector is tackling challenges related to spice import, quality assurance, and regulatory compliance. Here with me in the room, we have Professor Samir Dani that will help me moderating the forum at the end of this webinar. Professor Samir Dani is a professor of operation and supply chain management in Keele Business School at Keele University. He's also the deputy director of the Digital Society Institute at Keele University. Professor Dani engages widely with industry and has a research interest in supply chain risk, sustainability in supply chain, and the use of technology and business models. He is currently conducting research in the use of AI techniques with supply chain decision making and the use of blockchain technology in supply chain. His research focuses on food supply chain, and he has published widely and has presented his research to both academic and practitioner audience. Samir, if you want to say a few words.
Sorry, I pressed microphone. Okay, thank you very much, Tiziana. Right. Yeah, it was a quick introduction. Very, very important webinar for all of us. Today, we have great speakers lined up. I will keep a watch over the Q&A, so please do post your question and answers. Questions. We will give you the answers. And I just want to say we are also joined today by Dr. Venkatachalam Murugan, who is the Consul General of India in Birmingham, And we would like to thank the CG for his support for this webinar. We would also like to thank the Ministry of Commerce and Industry in India, the Spice Board of India, Food Standards Agency UK, and Trading Standards UK for all the support for arranging this webinar. So I'm not going to take more time. I'm going to pass you on to Dr. Tiziana, and we will keep a watch over your chat listing and the questions. So please feel free to send in that information. So Dr. Tiziana,
Okay, so I guess we can start, and I hope that you enjoy today's session. The first speaker for today is Milan Sham, a spice trader with over 2 decades of experience in food security, sustainability, and international trade. Milan has held a leadership role in major trade association and multilateral institution, including the Food and Agriculture Organization and the World Trade Organization. With extensive expertise in regulatory compliance, global food and supply chain, and the space trade, it brings invaluable insight into today's discussion. Milan will be presenting on importing spices into the UK. Milan, over to you.
Good, thank you, Tiziana, and Consul General, thank you for joining us. And thank you to all the stakeholders who've brought this initiative together. There's a particular problem that was trying to be solved in terms of the germ of this idea when the key stakeholders came together. And I'll try and hit that nail on the head a bit later on during my presentation. But really, my presentation is quite simple. So let me just share my screen. And Tiziana, on behalf of the audience, if you could tell me whether you can see my slides.
Yes, we can see.
You are seeing my slides.
You.
Excellent, excellent. So look, I'm dealing with the very simple subject of importing Indian spices into the UK, specifically looking at India as an origin. Let's see what we're going to cover. So what I plan to cover firstly, in terms of the intention of this session, is what are spices? I think it's important that we get a handle on what we mean by spices. Then we're going to look at the conundrum of international trade and also how it's been solved by a particular contractual framework. Then let's look at the Indian exporter's perspective when they're sending spices to the UK. Let's look at the UK importer's perspective when they're importing spices into the UK. And then let's really ask ourselves, what's the problem? Because it's the fact that there's something that doesn't feel right that has brought these stakeholders together. And then I'm going to talk a little bit about technical risk management down supply chains and the importance of sampling and analysis. And then we'll take any questions, but really we've got a session for questions at the end. So I'll probably push my time limit to the end if that's okay, and then we'll take questions at the end. So what are spices? Well, spices quite simply they're a very wide group, and that's what I want you to appreciate as an audience, but they are fragrant, aromatic, or pungent edible plant substances. So if you think of the majority of spices that you know, they would fall into that range of having some sort of aromatic quality. They also impart flavor, aroma, or color when added to food. So some spices are very cleverly used in food development to deliver colors where synthetic colors are not permitted or frowned upon. In very simple terms, spices are various dried parts of a plant, because if you take a particular botanical, there's a dried part of it that might be used as a spice. And in the modern trade, the spices are traded in whole, broken, ground, or blended form. So it's really that simple. And if you look around legislation, I found this relatively arcane piece of recent legislation updated in November 2022. Again, when it decided to refer to spices, it defined them as follows. So this is an EU, there's a definition used in EU primary legislation. Spices means any dried, fragrant, aromatic, or pungent edible vegetable or aromatic plant in whole or ground form, except for those plants that have been traditionally regarded as food. So onions, garlic, and celery, they carve out. There's many people in the spice trade where we would actually sell onion, garlic, and celery. Whether we call it a spice or not, academic, if you were to go back several hundred years, sugar was a spice because it was just something exotic that came from the other end of the world. So I think now we have an idea of what spices are. But as I said, two things to remember. They're just different dried parts of a plant, but they're a very wide group. So let's look at how wide that group is. So along here, I have listed different parts of a plant, which when dried become different spices. And you will recognize various spices in that list in terms of my examples. It is that diversity and complexity that makes them that bit harder to manage. If we were merely trading tea, then we have a single plant called Camellia sinensis that is planted in different agroclimatic conditions globally. But there's essentially one botanical that we're dealing with. Here, we're dealing with a very wide range of botanicals, and they're grown in a very wide range of agroclimatic conditions. So to really know your plant and to know its origin, you're accumulating a lot of information. And you're managing a wide range of risk. And that's why spices are a risky game. So spices have been traded from pre-biblical times. I mean, if you look in human history, spices have been traded for thousands of years. But let's look at this. International trade now has many different aspects, and international trade now. Well, let's think of it quite simply. So, I would like all of you in the audience to put yourselves into the mindset of an Indian exporter of spices. So I'd like you to role play and imagine that you are an exporter of cardamom. Cardamom, let's just remind ourselves, what is cardamom? Cardamom, is it on this list? It's a pod. No, they've got vanilla as a pod, but cardamom is also a pod. And you are going to export cardamom to me, and I'm the UK importer sitting in London. So, question one, and these are just rhetorical, so please, no need to use the chat, no need to come off mute. Essentially, I want to buy a 40-foot container of cardamom from you, 20 tons of cardamom, $25 a kilo. And you want to sell that container of cardamom to me. So what happens? We agree that. Let's say we have a phone call, we agree that. Let's say we have an email exchange and we agree that. What then happens? Are you going to send me the cardamoms? I checked them. I'm happy with them. I send you the money. Or are you going to ask for the money first? Now, if you are the Indian exporter, then from your point of view, your security only comes if you get the money first. Because if you send the cardamoms and I don't send you the money, then you're how much down? $500,000 for one single container of cardamoms. $25 a kilo, 20 tons of cardamoms in that container. So that's $500,000 riding on that single container. So the point is, you want the money first. Whereas, do I really want to part with $500,000, send it to you in India, and then a month and a half later, the goods arrive and I'm not happy with them? So that essentially is why I say there's a conundrum in international trade, is which party is going to trust the other party? Because that's the only way trade is going to happen, is if one party trusts the other, or if both parties trust each other. So how was that solved? That was solved many years ago. And in fact, it was the spice trade that spurred the innovation that came to the solution. That was solved through this system, documentary finance. So the trade as it happens today is not as simple as I'm importing in the UK, you're exporting from India. Trade as it happens now is, and this is a very simple schematic, but let's run through it. You've got Indian exporter on the left, so you can see his growing his cardamom there. That cardamom, let's say we've made a contract where I've said that I will buy a container of cardamom. What I in fact do is I say, I will make a contract with you to buy a container of cardamom, and in that contract, I will pay my $500,000 if you send me documents that evidence that you have filled a container and sent it on the right vessel with the right quality and quantity of cardamoms. Does that make sense? So basically what we're saying is we're saying to the Indian exporter, I'm not going to wait till the cardamoms arrive. If you can send me documents that prove to me that you have sent me the right quantity and quality of cardamoms and that meet my contractual requirements, I will send you the money based on those documents. So what actually happens in terms of the contract is formed with those terms. The performance of the contract goes as follows. The cardamom supplier will prepare the cardamoms, make sure they're of the right quality, test them, check them. They'll fill a container. $500,000 of cardamoms are filled in a container and they go to the vessel. So they'll go to a vessel at an Indian port. At that Indian port, the master of the vessel will give a receipt to the Indian exporter called a bill of lading. And that bill of lading, well, the master of the vessel will then set sail and start heading towards the UK. But in the meantime, that bill of lading, plus any lab certificates showing test results for those cardamoms, any weighbridge certificates showing the weight of cardamoms in that container, all of those documents will be bundled together and they'll be put under another document called a bill of exchange that then will go from the Indian exporter to their bank at the bottom, and then from their bank to a UK bank at the bottom. And then the UK bank will basically say to me, as the importer into the UK, Milan, I've got some documents for you from this Indian exporter. I've got some cardamom documents for you. Can you come and have a look at them? So I will look at the documents. And if I'm satisfied that the documents give me enough confidence that the goods that will arrive on that vessel in parallel will be goods of the right quantity and quality, then I'll say, okay, from my account, release $500,000. They go to my bank. From my bank, they go to the Indian bank. And from the Indian bank, they go to the supplier in India. So the supplier in India gets his money and the container eventually comes. And the only way that I can get the shipping company to hand the container over to me is to use one of the documents from that bundle that the bank has given me. And that document is that bill of lading. So I turn up with that bill of lading, which is like a receipt, and I hand it to the shipping company and they say, you're the valid recipient of this container. There you go. Here's your container of cardamom. Now, it was the spice trade hundreds of years ago that prompted the invention of this system. And the spice trade is one of many trades now, but the entirety of globalization relies on this system. So that's what I wanted you to appreciate, that that's how the trade works. Now, the point is you need a contractual framework within which to do that. So for international trade, you might not just form a simple contract on a piece of paper. You might use trade association standard terms. And in the spice trade, historically, this is what was used. International General Produce Association. So the IGPA, or International General Produce Association, was the trade association whose contracts we used. I still see these IGPA contracts floating about from origin countries. I need to remind everybody, and any exporters from origin countries, especially from India, the IGPA no longer exists. It was merged into another trade association called GAFTA 20 years ago, and the IGPA contracts have been discontinued. So really, what is critical is if you're trading internationally in agri-produce, don't use IGPA contracts, use GAFTA contracts. Now, GAFTA, the majority of contracts are for vessel loads of wheat or soy or corn, but GAFTA does have a suite of what are called container contracts, and they are wholly suitable for trading spices. So I'll give you an example. The most commonly used one in the trade is GAFTA contract number 88. And GAFTA contract number 88, you can go onto GAFTA's website. So GAFTA is a very big international trade association that professionalizes international trade. And GAFTA has contracts freely available to the trade. You don't have to necessarily be a member, although GAFTA has 2,000 members. But you'll find contract number 88 amongst them. 88 is for CIF and CNF terms, which you'll remember from international trade. There's 89, which I believe is for FOB contracts, and I think 90 is for ex-store terms. But please go and look at the GAFTA contracts, because that is what you should be using for agri-produce international trade. And those contracts then are several pages of defining what happens in different scenarios. If you have a dispute, so if I then have a dispute with my cardamom supplier in India, what the GAFTA contract says is, dear parties, you've agreed not to go to court, but you're going to come to GAFTA arbitration to resolve your dispute. So instead of going to a court, we go to specialists in the trade who are arbitrators, and that's how the dispute is resolved. What I would say is that do be mindful of the costs of dispute resolution. If you've got a dispute over a container, if you've got a dispute over a container of cardamoms, $500,000 it may be worth going to arbitration. If you've got a dispute over a container of coriander, just resolve it amongst yourselves. Do not go through this dispute resolution procedure, because there's a certain minimum cost that's involved, and it's all on the website. So let's look. I said we'll look at things from 2 points of view. Let's look at things from the point of view of the Indian exporter. What does the Indian exporter have to do? Well, if the Indian exporter is doing the following, which is trading on Amazon, they don't really have to do that much, because are the regulators in Western jurisdictions paying a lot of attention to online trade? Well, latterly they are, but generally, if you're exporting small quantities of tea from Sri Lanka, or if you're exporting cardamoms from southern India or something, you can do it online, and you're unlikely to have the controls applied to you that I'm going to explain for container loads that are coming in. Yeah, on Amazon's own website, they've got a guide to exporting spices from India. Okay, Indian exporter. All you're doing is you're forming a contract with your customer. So you are agreeing in that contract that you will supply spices that meet the agreed product specification. That's pretty straightforward. So meeting the agreed product specification could mean your customer said, send me a container of chili powder FAQ, fair to average quality. That might be enough between you that you both know you've got a meeting of minds on what you're sending. I will explain later why it's much better to have a detailed and explicit product specification so that everybody's clear on what's required. But anyway, your job as an Indian exporter is to send me what we've agreed. Now, in my product spec, I might put these terms in there. Compliance with all relevant UK regs or even EU regs. That is what is compelling you to then make your spices that you're sending to me comply with the regulations here in my jurisdiction. I don't think, but David, who is speaking next, can clarify, I don't think that a regulator sitting in the UK has jurisdiction to sanction an exporter sitting in India. So really, it's through the contract that the importer forms with the exporter that the exporter is going to try and comply with the regulations here in the importing jurisdiction. However, India is a curious country because India does something different to many other countries. India has export regulations for spices, and India has mandatory sampling and testing of spices that are going for export. Now, not every single spice that goes for export is sampled and tested by the Indian government, but quite an interesting and wide range are tested for a range of parameters. So I would like us all to step back and think, what is the Indian regulator doing? The Indian regulator is primarily interested in consumer protection for the Indian population of 1.4 billion Indians. Here, they are testing exports. So in testing exports, they are looking after the consumer health of the export destinations. So as I said, India is unusual because when you've got export regulations, what you're saying is, my goods that are leaving this country that are going to a different destination, I am concerned about my reputation in the market and I want to maintain minimum standards. The vast majority of countries will let their suppliers export ingredients without those controls. So I think, in one sense, I would applaud the Indian government in what they're doing in terms of spices. They know they have an interest in maintaining the reputation of Indian spices abroad compared to other origin countries, and they go the extra mile. So the Spices Board of India, which is the government entity that looks after this, has a network of people up and down the country that will physically go and sample certain spices before they're exported. And I don't think that's sufficiently appreciated in many of the destination countries. So let's look what happens. There's one bit that I want to clarify. On a CIF or CNF contract, cost insurance freight or cost and freight, the supplier's obligation, as I said, is to file documents that comply with the contract. If they file documents that comply with the contract with the importer is contractually bound to pay. Now, I want us to consider certain scenarios. Let's say that the Indian exporter of cardamoms puts those cardamoms on a vessel, sends me the documents. I agree with my bank, that's fine. I'll take the documents, send my $500,000 to the Indian. And let's say I'm sitting with the documents waiting for the vessel to arrive. I'm waiting to present my bill of lading. And let's say this happens to the vessel. Now, this is a real case study. We had an actual container of cardamom on this vessel, the MSC Flaminia in 2012. And this is what happened to the vessel. Now, spice trading was quite an adventurous trade 300-400 years ago. Still today, I'm sad to say 3 people lost their lives on that vessel. So I just want us to appreciate that international trade today is something we all take for granted, but it is still something that carries risk. Getting goods around the world carries risk. So here, the container was on this vessel where they had a small explosion, then a fire. So that container of cardamom did not reach Milan in London. But obviously Milan has contractually obliged to pay for the goods and has paid for the goods. And I want importers, so the exporter, what you have to recognize is that you're in a very comfortable position on CIF contracts because really your obligation finishes with filing compliant documents. If the goods don't arrive, that's at the risk of the importer, and that's why the importer takes insurance. This is not a rare occurrence. That's 2012. The very next year, 2013, we had a container of pepper coming from Vietnam on this vessel. What can you see on that vessel? Yes, that vessel is about to split in half. And in fact, I'll just show you, it's split in half at the bottom of this map in the Indian Ocean. And the 2 halves then swam apart in different directions. One half sank on the 27th of June, the other on the 10th of July, a lot further up, heading towards Pakistan, but one half on the coast of India. And again, we don't receive the goods in the UK, but we're honor bound and contractually bound to pay for them. So I just want importers in the UK to understand their risks that they're carrying, and the exporter from India is in a much more comfortable position. So let's now look at what the UK importer's perspective is. The UK importer is trying to import spices that comply with with UK regulations. And UK regulations, you've got 2 sorts. You've got the regulations that apply to all foodstuffs, whether they're grown in the UK or imported. Whether they're grown in the UK or not. And then you've got specific import regulations that are for when you bring stuff across borders into our jurisdiction. So as an importer, I'm trying to comply firstly with this, which I will call the official controls, originally set up in Europe, but we've assimilated them into our legislation. And for those official controls, what it's basically saying is, look, our regulator will quite rightly randomly check at our border various goods coming into the UK to check they comply. What could be simpler than that? And I would expect nothing less as a consumer in the UK. Obviously, some goods are seen as slightly higher risk, and there are certain annexes that have certain consequences of being in that annex as to how frequently they're sampled and whether there's any formality on the imports. So, for example, in some cases, you need a specific health certificate from the origin country in order to import. So if you're a UK importer, you must build that into your contract with your Indian exporter, because otherwise, how are they going to know what they have to do? Okay, but in addition to these border controls, and we're very fortunate to have David from the FSA, speaking specifically about that as the next speaker. So I'm not going to go any further into that. We also, as UK importers, we must comply with domestic legislation. So domestic legislation in the UK might include the food information regs. And the food information regs, amongst other things, say, you know, label things clearly. We want informed consumers in the UK who can make up their own minds what they buy. But in particular, there are a whole bunch of allergens that we worry about, and they must be labeled. And for those allergens to be labeled, you need to know whether they're in your product or not. And again, we haven't got time in an introductory session, but those of you importing spices where you think allergens are a risk, please go and look for this document. The Seasonings and Spice Association, which is a UK trade association, came up with it really to help the trade and to make sure that you know, we're all on the same page, regulators, the trade, exporters. So valuable work for the public benefit by a particular UK trade association. We also have other domestic UK legislation. So we've got the Food Safety Act, really basic piece of primary legislation. And amongst other things, the Food Safety Act says, look, you know, make sure that that what you're sending is pure. Now, spices for thousands of years have been susceptible to adulteration because they are of value and because you can, you know, there are stories going back to, you can translate Roman authors that will talk about the adulteration of spices, but it goes further back than that even. So nowadays we use lab-based techniques to verify the purity of what's in a herb or spice. But again, that Seasonings and Spice Association has done some really good work on how that's tested. And because Tiziana is going to expand on some of this, again, I won't go any further at this stage. So the next thing is, well, look, sorry, just a very quick clarification. I said UK regulations. I said we have to import spices that meet UK regulations, both import and domestic. One thing I would say is that there are different regulations in, well, we should be vigilant to different regulations in Northern Ireland, Scotland, and England and Wales. And again, I think, you know, if you've got any questions of that, David's the expert. So although some product specifications tell the Indian exporter comply with UK regs, possibly that could be done more precisely. Also, you'll see a lot of specifications saying comply with EU regs. Now, that suddenly gets a bit more complicated, and if you want to discuss it, we'll do it in the Q&A session. But there are many importers into the UK who then re-export their spices back into the EU, because one of the UK's biggest trading partners is the European Union. So if a UK importer is exporting back into the EU, or there's a complicated situation with Northern Ireland, we might want compliance with EU regs. So the complication will come when we eventually get divergence of UK regs and EU regs, but that's a bigger area to discuss, and we'll leave that for the Q&A. Next thing I want to say is that the contract is not just about complying with EU regs. In the contract, I may specify other parameters that the regulator has no interest in whatsoever. So for example, if I'm importing chilies from India, I might specify I want a certain level of heat measured by the Scoville index, and I want a certain color, so we use a colorimeter or color spectrometer to measure the color of all ingredients coming into us. So we may set a range within which we want that chili to be, because it's very important what the color is. So these are contractual requirements that are a private agreement between the importer and the exporter, really not of any interest to any regulator. Other areas where this happens is labor standards. So I, as an importer, might impose minimum labor standards on my exporter, you know, no child labor, health and safety standards, business ethics in terms of anti-bribery policies, sustainability standards. So all of these things that I might require of the exporter that sells to me from India are really not of interest to the food safety regulator. Okay. And then finally, I just want to clarify for everybody's benefit the difference between statutory and contractual liability. This is quite important. If there's a breach, so if we import something and it's later discovered that we've transgressed a pesticide MRL, for example, or the level of ochratoxin A is too high, or some other parameter has been breached that's a contaminant, then that entails liability, and there will be consequences if there's been a breach and it's on the market. So statutory liability is the liability that the regulator is going to pick up. But that statutory liability remains within the jurisdiction. So my belief is that the UK regulator will not stretch their long arm across to India and say to the Indian exporter, you sent us something that didn't comply. They will limit themselves to the first importer within the UK. And in the old days, it was the first importer within the EU. So I believe that the UK regulator will draw a line at the UK border as their jurisdiction. However, contractual liability, that can flow across borders. So the fact that you have a contract and on those GAFTA terms you can claim arbitration, I as a UK importer can go and claim on my Indian exporter under GAFTA arbitration on any of those parameters, on labour standards, on heat and colour, and on compliance with UK or EU regs. But that's a contractual claim. That's not a regulatory statutory breach. Okay, so look, what's the problem? The problem seems to be, or the noise that I'm hearing in the industry, is delays at UK borders. Now, I do not have the data because I am not the regulator, so I don't have the data of how many consignments come to UK borders and what's being stopped and the granularity in that, because that's what we'd need to dig into in detail to understand, what's going on and why. However, I noticed that a particular trade association, the Seasonings and Spice Association, asked its importer members, not all are importers, but it asked its importer members, what are you finding? And here are some of their results. And I think this gives us a feel of what's going on. So firstly, importers into the UK are having their containers delayed. A median delay of 21 days, but anything up to, in one case, 113 days somebody experienced as to how long their container was there. Now, who is paying the rent and demurrage on that? It is the importer. So what's the cost? The cost is anything up to £20,000. Now, even at that median cost of 2,288, who makes enough profit that they can afford £2,288 of rent and demurrage on a container? Yep. So you're immediately loss making. And this is the situation that people worry about. The other great concern that has been going on for years, really, since the EU brought in official controls, is that when you sample sterilized or heat treated product, unless it's been sampled or sampled in a sterilized manner in a sanitized environment, we as the importer are then very reticent to let that go to our customer as a heat treated product. So that means that we've got destructive, it's not non-destructive testing. The drawing of that sample means that that bag can no longer be used for the purpose for which it was intended, which was as a sterilized product. A lot of effort will have gone to use heat treatment to go down 6 log cycles of microbial load, and then it's compromised. So what I would say is this is not unique to spices. Nuts are imported, they face the same thing. Iranian pistachios, notorious for being stopped at the border and tested for mycotoxins. But that's fine, it's because there's a risk there. But they also face the same things. And it's not unique to the UK. I had a lot of experience in Brussels at exactly the time the official controls were brought in. And this was happening across the EU. So it's not unique to the UK, it's not unique to spices. So the question is, what proportion of products, when they're tested on arrival, are actually non-compliant? Now, I don't know that. I think it is reported by the regulator at certain points in time into the public domain. I have a feeling that because the Food Standards Agency is a very transparent organization in terms of its governance, so it does reveal a lot of information. But this would be interesting to find out, because if you are finding high levels of prevalence of, let's say, pesticides, it's fully understandable that you then you target your testing to look out for more pesticides. those pesticides are coming from certain countries, you might look at that more closely. But equally, my guess is that the majority is sailing through fine. I asked my own team in the office, in 2024, how many containers did we have that were rejected at the border? 0. How many were stopped? Quite a few. So the regulator is doing their job. They're stopping the containers to check them, but then if everything's okay, they go through. Just as we would at an airport terminal, we'd be stopped by security. Everything's okay, we go through. I think the question where I'd really be interested in digging into the data, but I understand why we can't, is which UK importers and which UK exporters are the ones that are transgressing? Because that would be a much more targeted way of understanding what's going wrong, and those are the people we need to educate. So one area that came up was that I think people sometimes feel that regulation is not joined up globally. But to be honest, on this front, the Food Standards Agency certainly is on the front foot. As I said, I used to deal with DG Sanko in Brussels for a long time. And they would publish stuff and they would expect people in origin countries to then pick up what they're saying. No, here, look, we've got a method that we've just discussed with the Food Standards Agency where 2 trade associations, GAFTA and the European Spice Association, will feed the UK evolving regs into IOSTA, the International Organization for Spice Trade Associations, and they'll pass it to member organizations in origin countries, which includes, amongst others, Spices Board of India. So I think certainly on this front, the spice industry should rest assured that it's going to benefit from a more joined up approach to global regulation than you will find in many, many jurisdictions. So really, what's the problem? Well, this is my own personal analysis. I'm neither speaking for my company nor for UK spice importers generally. This is literally just from my own experience of being in the trade. I think firstly, the Indians' perspective that I hear is very simple. Our spice shipments are being stopped and rejected at UK borders. Look, they're being stopped because they're being tested. They're being rejected if they fail. UK perspective, we're discovering significant non-compliance in spices from India. Both of those can be true at the same time. And I think if I were to then dig down and put forward a hypothesis as to where the problem lies, I think the problem lies with UK importers. Because I think, firstly, it's utterly wrong, in my opinion, to blame the Indian government. The Indian government is bending over backwards to put minimum standards in place and is putting resources behind export policing. So I don't think the Indian government, India is a massive country that will produce a wide range of spices, some of which will comply with UK regs and some won't. Indian exporters will only fulfill what their contract says. So it's really up to the UK importers to define contracts and then make sure they comply that are within the UK's parameters regulatory wise. First thing we see from time to time, insufficiently detailed product spec, or not even a product spec, just send me a container of chili powder. Just not adequate. You need a product specification. You cannot presume that the exporter will ship something that meets the product spec. You as an Indian exporter cannot presume that what you've bought meets the spec. You've got to have some method by which you've assured yourself that the product you're sending meets the product spec. The 2 standard methods throughout industry, not the spice trade, not just food ingredients, but throughout industry. Firstly, you engage in some form of assurance through risk management. And secondly, you have some form of assurance through product analysis. And if you're not doing that, then don't be surprised when on the odd occasion, when your container is stopped and tested, it transgresses. Even if you do all of these things, you will have containers you will have products that fail. I can tell you that, we regularly will see, when I say regularly, in an average year, I would say on up to half a dozen occasions, I will see product that has been tested at origin, has a risk map and risk assessed supply chain, is clear, arrives in the UK, tested again, is clear, and then at a later stage is tested again and is not clear. So even then it's always possible, but if you've gone through all these hoops, it's much less likely. So I think it's some importers into the UK, not all. And I think it's those importers that really, look at what you're doing and see, and reach out to, to anybody else in the industry to say, look, can you assist us? What can we do to up our standards? A quick word then about what I mean by technical risk management. So on supply chain assurance, you've got to approve your suppliers. You've got to think, how are you approving your supplier? On what parameters are you approving your supplier? You've got to approve your product then, because the supplier's approved, but they might not be approved for every product they do. So you really got to look at the products. And you've really got to get a risk map from cultivation onwards. But that risk map is just a document. How do you know that the assertions in that document are true? Best solution, physically walk it, validate those assertions, go down to where it grows and walk the route all the way up to the factory that then processes it. Because otherwise, you're putting all your efforts on testing, and you cannot test all products for all risks. That's just not cost effective. We all know that. So look, let's some very quick examples. I'm conscious of the time, so I'm just going to run through very quickly. Look, a Carolyn homestead, intercropping, smallholder, might be growing lots of stuff together. If when I look at a risk map or I trace back to where my spices are growing, I see that, then I want to check, are they growing sesame? Are they growing peanut alongside coffee and pepper and cardamom? Because if they are, those then go on my test schedule because I'm worried about the cross-contamination risk, which is why more and more spice cultivation is going to this type of monoculture. Now, we're not fans of monoculture, but when you've got this type of cultivation, that means that we know the soil it's growing in. We know exactly which soil it's growing in. So we've tested it for the heavy metals. We know what cadmium, lead, etc. is in there. We know what they've sprayed as pesticides. We know what the risks are from other things. Much, much more controlled environment. So you've got a lot more intelligence about the risks to your product to think about. You've got risks when the product dries. I'm going to run through this quickly. Here, so this is, and many of you in India will recognize this as Unja. Unja is a town in Gujarat that is a big center for cumin and other seed spices. Now, if the cumin and other seed spices are grown in the method I showed you here on the right, which is monoculture, then you've got control all the way back to the farm of what's happened to that cumin. If, on the other hand, you're buying your cumin from this market, you have no idea what's happened at cultivation or since then. Yep. I would say that since the beginning of February, or over the last 6 weeks since the harvests come in, 1 million bags of cumin will have been delivered to this yard, which is the APMC, Agricultural Produce Market Committee yard in Unja. And what I'm saying about visiting, look, last month I went to visit our turmeric growers in Tamil Nadu in southern India. Here, as we speak today, the turmeric is being harvested and will soon arrive in the UK as dried turmeric. This was a plant we pulled out of the ground a month ago when I was there. So obviously it's immature, it will grow further. But again, with the suppliers, so you have basically, in this type of agriculture, you will have a team of field workers who are regularly going to the farmers. They've got a digital app on their phone. They're geo-logging all the data about all the, all bits of where that's grown. And then you'll have agronomists who give further education as to what to do. And they work with the farmers. The farmers are the ones with the dhotis, and they have immense expertise culturally themselves because for generations their families have been doing these things. Right, finally, you get to analysis and sampling. So finally, and I'm going to run through this very quickly, you can't test all products for everything, so you need to do some risk management and gather intelligence. You then manufacture an analysis plan based on that. Tiziana is going to go through a lot of this, so I'll be quick. You want labs that are reliable. You want the methods to be validated that they're using. You want the lab to have experience with spices because they're notoriously difficult to test. You look at things like limits of detection, cross-reactivity, and you must keep a budget for analysis. It's not, something you do exceptionally. This is something you have to budget for. But key thing, your analysis result is only as good as your sample. And so there's a lot of questions that you will ask, and I'll run through them here. There's a lot of questions you ask about how you're sampling. And you'll still get different results. And then finally, just because you've got a clear result does not mean that it's not present. So it might say gluten not detected at 5 parts per million. Well, it could be present at 3 parts per million. Also, a clear result for that test means that sample was clear, but you could have a pocket of a contaminant hiding elsewhere. Or you could just get a false negative. You know, labs do false negatives. And then again, Tiziana will cover this in more detail, but you've got to look at your lab methodologies. But finally, 2 quick points. False positives. False negatives is saying don't rely on it just because you've got a clear certificate. False positives, bane of the industry. In 2005, millions of pounds worth of food stocks were withdrawn from UK shelves because colorings, Sudan 1, Para Red, and other colorings were found at trace levels in the ingredients. Later, when an analysis was done by the Indian Spices Board of what had actually gone on, a very high proportion, well over a third, were false positives. So the food manufacturers and retailers had acted on the first lab result, but when further work was done, it was shown that it was a false positive. So a needless waste of food. The most recent example that really stands out, and this is my final word, you know, we had some massive, we had a whole bunch of recalls a few years ago in the UK because everybody was testing for nut allergen in products like cumin and paprika. And it was all triggered by a particular packer of retail spices being told that your product has almond presence in it. And again, you can test protein, you can test DNA, different areas. Later, after all the product recalls had happened, it was discovered that it wasn't almond, it was a different product called Mahaleb, but that gives a similar result on a lab test. And so that almond result on which everything was predicated and that forced not only that company to do its recalls, but all the other testing afterwards was a false positive. And it sent the entire industry on a wild goose chase. Credit to the FSA, when the science came back and said it's false positive, FSA came straight to the industry and said, look, this is what we found. You know, journalists will always report it as backtracking, but I see that as maturity and honesty on the part of the FSA. Right, questions we'll take later in Samir's session at the end. And I just finally want to thank De Montfort for hosting and the Indo-British Trade Council for tackling this conundrum. Thank you all very much.
Thank you very much, Milan. A fascinating presentation, and thank you for the information that you shared. We'll leave the question at the end because of timing. So now I want to introduce our next speaker, David Lowe, the head of imported food safety intelligence at the Food Standard Agency. So the FSA is responsible for public health policy in England, Wales, and Northern Ireland, ensuring consumers continue to have access to safe imported food and feed. David has been a civil servant since 1987, specializing in public health and food safety, and has been with FSA since 2003. Since 2019, he has led the imported food safety team, overseeing the repatriation of key food safety control from the EU, with particular focus on high-risk food and feed known of animal origin. Then we will be presenting today on the importation of high-risk food not of animal origin into Great Britain. David, the floor is yours.
Thank you very, very much. First of all, I'd just like to thank Dr. Scammer and Professor Danny for the introduction to this workshop. It's a pleasure to meet you all and really just to understand a little bit about the one part of the trade that we regulate. Like Milan, I'm going to go through the presentation. Quite happy just to take questions towards the end. Okay, if I share my screen. And of course, I'm hoping I've got the reassurance that you can all see that.
Yes, it's on the screen, David. Thanks.
Okay, thank you very much. That's it. Like I said, thank you very much for inviting us to this to the workshop. It's a great opportunity, really, just to engage with industry and just to understand a little bit more about the spice trade. So, as Dr. Scammer said, my name is David Lowe. I'm the head of imported food safety within the Food Standards Agency, the team that I manage sit within the UK and International Affairs Directorate within the agency. And my team has responsibility for monitoring the safety of imported food, deciding when to implement a control at the border, and that's to ensure that imported feed meets our food safety requirements. So in this presentation, which will take approximately 20 minutes or more, I'm going to provide an overview of the FSA, really the role of central and local government at the border, because they are quite different, and how we monitor imported food safety risks and the application of border controls. So really, the role of the Food Standards Agency, this is going to be a very quick overview, really just to introduce the FSA. It's really important to remember that the FSA is an independent, non-ministerial department. We were established in 2000 on back of the BSE crisis, and our objectives and powers and duties are set out in legislation, primarily the Food Standards Act 1999. We work across England, Wales, and Northern Ireland, and we have two main objectives in law, and that is to protect public health and to protect the interests of consumers in relation to food safety. And we are governed by an elected board whose members are appointed by the Secretary of State for Health and Social Care, and we have the power to publish information independent of ministers and government, and that's quite a powerful tool that we have. So ministers can't gag us, they can't tell us not to or to suppress information. We work on behalf of the consumer, and that's something that we place great store by having that relative independence. The FSA is responsible for assessing food and feed safety risk and advising ministers on managing these risks. And that's because the UK agri-food sector is worth something about £116 billion to the UK economy. As you can imagine, a major outbreak of foodborne illness would be hugely detrimental to this sector and to public health. We therefore rely heavily on data-driven surveillance and sampling to identify and mitigate foodborne disease risk. I guess we believe a strong UK regulatory system underpins confidence in the UK food industry, and this confidence enables the UK to export over £20 billion of food annually. I think it's worth mentioning as well that in the UK, the food sector generates £240 billion in consumer expenditure a year alone, and it employs 12% of all GB workers. So it's quite significant from an economic point of view. So a little bit about the assurance. So the FSA oversees an assurance regime which is delivered by 350 local and port health authorities who have responsibility for delivering food safety controls inland and at the border. I think I ought to mention as well about 45% of all food consumed in the UK is imported. So ensuring it's in compliance with GB food safety standards is very important for the FSA. So a little bit more about the FSA. In 2022, the FSA developed its 5-year strategy, which is called Food You Can Trust. We have three main objectives. First one is really just to make sure that food is safe. We all have the right to expect that food we eat will not make us ill. And then we have food is what it says it is. So when people buy food, they should be confident that it's what it says it is. And lastly, food is healthier and more sustainable. We want to play our role in helping to ensure that food is healthier for people and more sustainable for the environment. Our strategy sets out how we will continue to protect consumers, and the link within the slide provides access to that document should you wish to read it. We're already now starting to formulate the next strategy from 2027 onwards. So I put this slide in. This is responsibilities at the border, and as you can see from the many titles on the right-hand side of that screen, it's a busy place at the border. There's a lot of agencies involved, and as I said previously stated, about 45% of all food is consumed in the UK. Within the UK is imported, so you won't be surprised to learn that we have developed a robust border system designed to protect consumers and our economy. The slide in front of you sets out the roles and responsibilities of different organisations at the UK border for ensuring imported food is safe. The FSA, covering England, Wales and Northern Ireland, and FSS have public health responsibilities for the safety of imported food. And that's important there. We have public health responsibilities. DEFRA in GB and DERA, Department of Agriculture, Environment and Rural Affairs in Northern Ireland, are responsible for ensuring biosecurity is maintained. So plant and animal health are their responsibilities. While the FSA, FSS, that's Food Standards Scotland, DEFRA and DERA have policy responsibility for ensuring controls are proportionate and effective, our local and port health authorities, who are in themselves local centres of government, are responsible for delivering controls that are applied at the border. This means that the consequences of applying controls at the border rest with local and port health authorities. They make the decisions as to how controls are delivered. And the point I'm trying to make here is that while we have policy responsibility for setting the control, local and port health authorities have policy responsibility for delivering those controls. And that's the difference we're trying to make. The administration and delivery of both food safety controls and biosecurity controls is very complex, and you can take it from all these organisations that appear at the border, and therefore you won't be surprised that systems have evolved which capture the role of all these organisations. So this is captured in what we call the multi-annual national control plan. It's about 176 pages, which explains the roles of each of these departments at the border. If you can't sleep at night, I do recommend reading this document. It will send you to sleep in the end. The plan details the roles and responsibilities of departments and agencies, embedded within the presentation, which will be circulated. You can click on that link and it will take you through to that plan. Given the number of agencies that are involved, you won't be surprised that a number of systems have evolved to enable us to communicate between these agencies. We do share information, and it's probably centred through the National Food Crime Unit at the moment, but we all have that ability from all these agencies to feed information back, assess information intelligence, and then sort of like split it up to where it needs to be. So we have a good relationship with each other, and we do share information. So a little bit about GB import controls. In May 2022, you'll be aware the UK government announced its intention to look at the controls we apply at the border to modernise and update how we import food and feed into GB. And since January 2024, we've phased in new import controls. So all countries, including the EU, must pre-notify the import of high-risk food and feed. We've aligned both the EU and rest of the world countries into new products of animal origin risk categorization system. So primarily BTOM, or the Border Target Operating Model, focuses on products of animal origin. So what are the big changes for this area? Changes are massive. Risk is reviewed every 6 months. The frequency of checks at the border may vary between 0 and 30%. However, note well, without exception, all imports of products of animal origin, I know we're here to talk about food not of animal origin, but all products of animal origin must be pre-notified. That means on iPass, an importation electronic system. will be subject to risk-based checks upon arrival in GB and must be accompanied by an export health certificate. So what are the impacts of imported food not of animal origin? Well, the BTOM really introduces no change for this commodity group. These products were never controlled at the UK border. So if you're importing a food not of animal origin product, the BTOM continues that approach. It's a non-controlled product commodity at the border. So no risk-based checks at the border, other than low-level surveillance monitoring, no requirement to pre-notify an IPAS or provide an export health certificate. So very, very different from how we treat imported products of animal origin. So in a way, to see that the BTOM has recognised sort of like that the previous really the non-controlled aspect of importing food not of animal origin, and it's continued that. So can come in through any border control point, won't be subject to any checks. However, and this is I guess the point that about this workshop, where we have public concerns with imported food not of animal origin, we refer to these commodities as high risk food not of animal origin. And these commodities are listed in Regulation 2019/7093. The exception is that when these commodities are imported, they must be pre-notified where they appear in Annex 1, and if they appear in Annex 2, then they will be subject to pre-dispatch laboratory checks, export health certification, and will be subject to risk-based checks upon arrival within the UK. The two links that are embedded within the presentation, first of all, for those of interest, we'll take you through to Regulation 2019/1793. You can look at the products and countries that appear in Annex 1 and Annex 2, and the risk categorisation for non-EU imported products of animal origin, really just for interest. So, importing food not of animal origin. So, like I said in the last slide, the vast majority of imported food not of animal origin is not controlled at the UK border. So no checks undertaken other than routine surveillance monitoring, no requirements to pre-notify an IPAS or complete a common health entry document. These non-controlled commodities from any country can enter GB through any point of entry. However, the expectation is that the importer will ensure that these commodities comply with our general food safety requirements. I think Milan just set out a few of those requirements in his last presentation. So there's an overall responsibility that if you as an exporter and you as an importer bring in products into GB, then you will make sure that they are compliant with our food safety requirements. So principally looking at the requirements in Regulation 178 and 852. These are general food safety requirements for placing food on our market. And I guess for this particular group, you'll be more focused on that they are ensure that the commodities meet specific requirements as they relate to pesticides, aflatoxins, and microbiological residues. So you'll be looking to sampling of imported FNAO for the presence of pesticides. You won't be surprised these are carried out by local and port health authorities through their surveillance monitoring. When a positive result is detected, the consignment will be detained. And if it's travelled inland, FSA incidents are informed. They will all coordinate the tracing of the consignment and its removal from the GB market. And as Milan said, sometimes that can go wrong when we get a false positive. Some of the main requirements you should be aware of, although, are Commission Regulation 466, which sets out maximum levels of contaminants for mycotoxins. We've got the pesticide regulations, which set out maximum residue limits. And we've also got microbiological criteria for certain FNAO products described in Regulation 2073. It's important to state that these requirements have been set by expert committees, whether that's within GB or when we were part of the EU. They are science and evidence-based, and they're reviewed regularly. They unequivocally establish what is acceptable and not acceptable regarding food safety, particularly for those foods that are imported into GB. Well, apologies, this is a rather busy slide, but it does provide some useful references to the controls that we apply to imported high-risk food and feed not of our animal origin. It's important to stress only those commodities from certain countries which we either have suspicion or evidence of a public health risk are controlled under Regulation 2019/1793. This regulation allows the FSA to introduce import controls on high-risk FNAO, such as spices, herbs, fruit, etc. The current regulation only controls 56 commodity types from 37 countries. It's worth noting that 41% of the commodities that appear in this regulation are controlled due to concerns about pesticide residues, an area that's steadily grown and of concern to the FSA. Any commodity or country combination we list in Regulation 1793, we refer to as high-risk FNAO. So issues we see at the border, such as pesticide residues, are dynamic, and this is why we review the controls every six months. Changes to the controls applied to imported high-risk FNAO is via a statutory instrument, and the SI must be amended not just in Westminster, but also in the Welsh and Scottish Parliament. So it can be a slow, tedious and complex process to introduce and de-escalate border controls in this particular area. It's important to say that we apply the same process for controlling high-risk food and feed not of animal origin as the EU. It's the same legislation. It's Regulation 2019/1793. When we control imported high-risk FNAO, we do so through two routes. When we suspect a commodity does not meet our import standards, we can list it in Annex 1. The importer is required to pre-notify consignments on IPAS, and this gives our local and port health authorities the opportunity to carry out risk-based checks when consignments enter GB. This provides the FSA with compliance data and enables us to postulate what we might do in the future. When we have evidence of a risk, we use Annex 2, which requires the competent authority of the exporting country to undertake a laboratory analysis before export, as well as completion of an export health certificate and pre-notification on IPAS. On arrival, consignments will be subject to risk-based checks. The control levels that we set for pesticide residues in Regulation 1793 are those MRL levels that are set in UK pesticide legislation. The FSA has a great working relationship with the Health and Safety Executive and DEFRA pesticide teams, and we have formally attend the meetings of the Expert Committee on Pesticide and the Expert Committee on Pesticide Residue in Food, PRIF, to ensure food safety. It's important to stress that where we see good compliance at the border, we will and have de-escalated import controls. Whenever we seek to introduce an import control, we will contact the relevant embassy of the country concerned and will endeavour to find out what steps have been taken to control a problem. We have in the past delayed the introduction of controls based on information supplied by the competent authority of the country concerned. We also consider what information supplied by industry. So we're currently consulting on the 4th review of high-risk FNAO controls, and I would encourage all on this call to respond to that consultation. Equally, where you have sampling data or knowledge of in-country competent authority contacts, please share this with the FSA. We will happily reach out to them to find out what is happening in country. There may be a lot of things that we're not aware of, and these things we take into account and will influence our decisions as to what we may or may not control. So reviews of high-risk FNAO controls are not always about introducing controls. It's also about removing controls where we see good compliance or we have additional information that's supplied to us from the exporting country. I put this slide in here, and I'm sure you'll be aware of the requirements, but some basics. Imported high-risk FNAO, so anything that appears in Regulation 1793, excuse me, must enter the UK through a border control post, a BCP, that is authorised to receive high-risk FNAO. If it arrives at any other point of entry, it will be considered an illegal import. BCPs exist to carry out food safety and biosecurity checks and are authorised to receive certain commodities such as POAO, products of animal origin, and high-risk food and feed not of animal origin, live animals, etc. So importers must check what a BC is authorised to receive. Again, the link in the presentation provides more information on what commodities UK BCPs are authorised to receive. Whenever a consignment is detained, Port Health Authority will notify you why it's been held. Indeed, you'll be provided with an opportunity to appeal the decision of the Port Health Authority through a magistrate's court. And finally, in most cases, rejected consignments can be re-exported, providing the relevant competent authority of the receiving country agrees to return. Only when consignments are so grossly contaminated that the PHA will make a decision to destroy the consignment. So this is a little bit about our risk assessment process. So in line with WTO guidance, our risk assessment process is based on the assessment of risk to human and animal health. When assessing risk, we look at volumes imported, worldwide intelligence such as RASAF data, GB border notifications, and we've developed a semi-quantitative risk assessment tool which we use to evaluate this information. The outputs from this tool drive our approach towards risk assessment. Risk assessment tool looks at hazard presence, so we therefore look at the end user at control, in-country control systems and controls we apply at the border. We also look at the hazard characteristics, so risk to health, severity, exposure to consumers, and finally we consider import volumes. Within the model, these areas are weighted. The outputs provide us with a risk score which enables us to track risk of the same commodity from the same country over time. All risk assessments are reviewed by the Imported Food and Feed Working Group, a committee of experts across the FSA and Food Standards Scotland, which has been established specifically to review the controls we apply to imported high-risk food and feed not of animal origin. The approach to risk categorisation and risk ranking of imported food of non-animal origin has been described in a study, and that's been published in the Journal of Food Protection. And again, I've embedded a link in the slide should anyone wish to look at this further. The outputs of the tool enables the FSA to assess long-term trends of importing high-risk FNAO and establish trigger points for further action, such as engagement with other countries to identify the root cause of the problem, and the suspension of trade, targeting of GB audits. I thought I'd put this one in again. This is about our national monitoring plan. So I guess other monitoring activities. The object of the NMP, or the National Monitoring Plan, is to provide guidance to UK enforcement officers and others, both inland and at ports, when developing their sampling programs to detect residues, pathogenic organisms, or any other substance hazardous to health, and to help ensure that food imported in the UK complies with relevant legislation. The NMP covers both products of animal origin and FNAO and is updated annually. When we assess imported foods such as FNAO, we may not have enough evidence to put it into Annex 1 of Regulation 1793. And so what we do is we put it into the NMP, and that encourages surveillance and sampling of imported consignments. And this provides us with additional intelligence, which we use to determine whether a product should or should not be controlled at the border. So I guess when we're reviewing evidence, we haven't got quite enough evidence, but we've got some signs that it may be a problem, we'll put it into the NMP. The NMP then is port sample over a 12-month period. We review that data at the end of the 12-month period, and then we decide whether we're going to take that forward into Annex 1, because we believe that there is, well, we have evidence that there is a problem. I guess things that concern the FSA. So overall, we are generally seeing increased pesticide residues and imported FNAO products from certain countries, and this is causing us some concern. This may be a result of climate change, who knows? Availability of pesticides, including counterfeit pesticides. I read an important statistic at any one time. I think 20% of pesticides on the free market are counterfeit. It could be something connected with that. It could be lack of knowledge when applied, or deliberate misuse. Whatever the issue, this is a worrying development for the FSA. We're also seeing worrying trends in aflatoxin contamination. Again, climate change might be a factor, wetter growing environments, poor damp storage, use of low-grade supplies, and improper handling of the product causing damage to the commodity. Again, a very worrying development for the FSA. And more recently, we've seen adulteration of spices and herbs with peanut powder. I know an allergen in the UK and many other countries. Is this deliberate adulteration to increase profit margins, or merely selection of low-grade commodities, or into unintentional contamination due to a lack of knowledge or care? We'd encourage all importers to make sure you have a robust contract. And these are all the things that Milan was talking about. Robust contract and product specification in place to ensure imported commodities meet GB food safety requirements. We also encourage importers to put in place checks to ensure contracts or specifications are delivered. And again, Milan was talking about those checks, how you provide that assurance at the border, so that the product you've ordered is the product you've received to the spec that you require. And I guess, it's probably teaching granny to suck eggs here, but know your supply chain. Where's the product sourced from? Where is it grown? What controls are put in place to ensure it's not contaminated? What was grown in the field the previous season? What is grown around the edge of the field? What's grown in the neighbouring field? How is the product picked? What machinery is used? Where is it stored? What's the route from the grower to the manufacturing establishment? Do they follow good practice? So I guess these are all the things that Milan was talking about, and we would echo it as well. Make sure you know your supply chain. Make sure you've got robust checks in place to ensure the product you've requested is a product you receive and it complies with GB food safety requirements. I just thought to put in this slide about border notifications, and this just might relate to some of the things that Milan talked about in terms of access to information. So whenever an import fails to meet GB food safety requirements, local or port health authority via IPAS will make a border notification, a BN. And this alerts the FSA to the failed import, and it provides information about the commodity, country, importer, and the reason for failure. The FSA validates the border notification. We check to ensure that all appropriate information has been provided, such as the laboratory report, and the BN is then made available to all other PHAs, so port health authorities, so they can be aware of the failed import and can use this intelligence to spot and target similar imports. This process allows the FSA to quickly build intelligence around non-compliant imports and disseminate information to other border control posts. Detained imports can usually be re-exported, providing the competent authority of the destination country agrees to accept the consignment. Occasionally, competent authorities may not agree, and occasionally we find it to be so grossly contaminated it will be destroyed. On a monthly basis, the FSA will publish our border notifications. So importers and food business operators have visibility as to what foods are rejected at the border. And I think within the slide, you've got an embedded link there that takes you through to the Imports Intelligence Hub. And there you will find a range of information on border notifications. You can scroll through that in spreadsheet format. And alongside that information, there's trade data. So if you look at the trade data for food not of animal origin, it will cover all the products that are considered high risk FNAO. So you can see you have visibility as to what products are being checked, what products have failed for documentary checks, what products have failed physical checks, what products have failed for laboratory checks. You've got that complete visibility through that trade information, and it's all there. We use it to really satisfy ourselves that our border control points continue to undertake risk-based checks, and they do it at the frequency we prescribed within the regulation. I hope this presentation, I'm sure it will be shared with attendees, and I've therefore put in a lot of useful links there that really take you to publicly available information on importing high-risk food and feed. Hope you agree, whether as a regulator or an importer, our common goal is to ensure consumers continue to have access to safe imported food. I think any disruption to this goal risks public health, undermines confidence in GB food safety, and this impacts not only on the FSA but importers and the industry as well. I'm going to end there, but I'd like to thank you for listening. I'm going to hand back to Dr. Sharma. Happy to take any questions.
Right. Well, thank you for that, David. Tiziana, is it echoing in there?
It's okay.
Okay, that's fine. That's fine. Thank you very much. Right. So we'll just move on to the next part of this webinar, which is, I'm sure, going to get a little bit more scientific from Dr. Tiziana Scama. And it's called DNA technology for spice quality assurance. So I'm just going to introduce Dr. Tiziana very briefly. Dr. Tiziana Scama is a associate professor at De Montfort University, leading the biomolecular technology group within the Faculty of Health and Life Sciences. Her research focuses on developing and applying DNA-based authentication methods for quality control in herbal medicines, food products, and aromatherapy. Dr. Scama holds a PhD in molecular plant biology from the University of Warwick and has established a strong research profile in the molecular identification of plant materials. Since joining De Montfort University, she has led projects advancing DNA barcoding techniques, shaping regulatory and industry standards, and her work is widely published in peer-reviewed journals. She has authored a REF impact case study. Now, REF is the Research Excellence Framework of the UK government. So REF impact case study on DNA authentication methods for herbal medicines. So very illustrious career, Dr. Scama. So on to you now for your presentation on DNA technology.
Thank you. I'm about to share my screen, so hopefully he will be with you in a second. I hope you are enjoying this webinar. Surely I'm enjoying it very much. I will talk a little bit about some of the technology that are used to ensure quality in spices. I may not go too much into technical details, both because many of you are probably not familiar with all the techniques, but also because I want to be able to have enough time at the end for everyone to share ideas. So I may skip or going just mentioning few elements in some of the slides, but they will be with you, so you have time to revise them better if you want to. Okay, so we probably all agree that it is very important to have a standard to check the quality of a herbal product. And we are all here today, in fact, because we share the same goal, which is ensuring that the spices reaching consumers meets the highest quality standard. Now, quality standards needs to have to be based on scientific base. They need to be useful for monitoring contaminant and product quality, but quite importantly, they also need to be intended to meet the needs of manufacturer, regulator, supplier, practitioner, and consumers. So not all the techniques are sometimes useful because they're difficult to be implemented. Many of you already implement rigorous quality assurance control, I'm sure, but some of you may have faced or may have been dealing with some product recall or adulteration issues. And these slides I want to reassure you that you are not alone. Unfortunately, this is a widespread industry challenge. So this is a research that has been done on generally on botanicals, so include herbal medicine, spices, and so on. And you can see that the range of contamination in product is quite high, going from Australia, where 79% of the product that been studied in this research were proved to be contaminated and pure, going down to Europe with 47%. Now, if we want to look closer to what happened, at home, here in the United Kingdom, and 37% of the products that were tested were somehow adulterated. Now, the European Commission in between 2019 and 21 organized a very big dive in research on looking at adulteration and contamination in herbs and spices. They tested about 1,885 samples, to be precise, and they used about 10,000 different tests to actually ensure the quality of these samples. So overall, they tested just 6 different spices that are here on the screen. And they found out that 17% of the product that they tested were indeed suspected to be adulterated. Most of the time, the adulteration was with non-declared plant material. And that was the case, for instance, with the oregano, where 49% of the sample were contaminated. And in most cases, the contamination was due to the presence of olive tree leaves mixed up with the oregano. 2% of the case we had non-authorized dye, and just one product showed the presence of lead chromate. So different range of how this adulteration was happening in these samples. So these findings underscore the need that we need to have a robust testing practice and vigilance around the product that there are on the market and every stage of the supply chain. You probably may think, who are the bad guys? Now, adulteration can occur at multiple levels. We could have a large corporation be involved, small business, and sometimes even one single person could cause this adulteration. Think about, I don't know, someone reusing bags for storage of different crops. So although sometimes these contamination or adulteration are accidental, other times these are not accidental but are actually intentional. So regardless, the business should conduct vulnerability risk assessment to safeguard their supply chain. And but what is important for me is what strategy we can use to check and ensure that the products that are on the market are indeed not contaminated or adulterated. Now, going back to the European Commission dive-in research, this is a very busy slide, and I don't need you to focus your attention on one particular element. But what I want to show you here is that in their study, they use a different range of technique for different purposes. So for instance, if they want to check the presence of papain in pepper, they use the high resolution mass spectrometry. While if they were looking for presence of element compound, they would have used an X-ray fluorescence spectroscopy. If they wanted to check the presence of contaminant and quantify the contamination, they may have used a qPCR real-time testing. So it's not only important to test your sample, but it's important to know what kind of technique are available and the reason why you would have to use one technique instead of another. It's also important for me say that it's important actually to use more than one testing technique to ensure that the products are indeed safe. So there are challenges, unfortunately, when we work with botanicals in general. There are lots of tests available, a lot of guidance, but sometimes not enough guidance. So it would be good to have a way to be sure to use the right testing for the right product against the element of disturb that we want to study. The testing costs can be quite high, especially for a small business, and also the supply chain is very long. Bear in mind that you could have a very good quality product that leave the field, but by the time that arrive on the shelf in a supermarket, something might have gone wrong. So it's important that each step of the supply chain is taken in consideration when the testing occur. There are also many variables of the botanical per se. Not every part of the plant will have, let's say, a particular compound that I want to test it for. So if this is not present in the root, but it's present in the leaf, I may have a false negative if I'm checking in the incorrect part of the plant. Also, storage condition and shipping condition can alter the composition of the element present inside the product, and all other things like the weather, the harvesting time. All of these influence the changes of element inside herbs, and therefore could lead to the incorrect results when tested. There are, of course, proposed solutions. First of all, knowing very well where your products are coming from. Milan mentioned this. He has been in the field where his products are growing. This is a very good practice. But also, train the people that are involved in the supply chain on what to do and what not to do to avoid any contamination risk. After analyzing the sample with the correct technique, the important thing is also understanding your results. And that sometimes is not very easy because the lab that provide you results might not get enough information to you. So always be sure that you need to understand your results, and it would be good that you have maybe someone to talk about if this is not the case. We'll be happy to help, so get in touch. The next sample would be take action. So if the results are not the one expecting, first of all, you probably want to confirm them, maybe with a different test for the same elements that you are already looking into, or using different techniques. So when we talk about testing, most of the time, people, the first thing they think about is physical testing. Physical testing are very good, and is looking and recognize plant based on what the plant look like, or small characteristic of the plant, like the shape of the leaves. Now, there are some advantages on this method, but there are also some disadvantages, which I listed here. Again, I'm not going to go all of them, but a clear example is from the picture that I'm providing. Some plants may look like very similar, and this could lead to misidentification of the plant. But also sometimes the importer receive a product that, for instance, is a dry material, and it becomes even more complicated to recognize what is the product in front of you. There are also a lot of other testing that we can put under the big umbrella of chemical testing. These are fantastic tests that you can do if you want to check a particular compound. But again, they have some limitation. You could have a false positive. I think Milan touched on upon this in terms of having a product that it could react on a similar way or show us another product when a chemical test is done. And often cannot differentiate between a synthetic element and a natural element that when the synthetic one has been added inside the product, for instance. So it could give a false negative also depending on the growth condition and storage. And you could maybe assume that your product is not the plant that you're looking for, but instead it was collected at the wrong developmental stage. And so the product that you're looking for is not present because the plant didn't have enough time to actually produce it. In my research lab, we use a slightly different technique, which we can put under the umbrella of DNA testing or molecular testing. Now, there are some limitations on using this technique as well, but it addressed quite a lot of the issue that I covered in the previous slides. So I am not proposing to use DNA testing as a only solution for testing spices, but I believe that the DNA testing should go hands to hand and in parallel with other technique. This is happening nowadays a bit more, but we still need to educate the public and the importer and exporter on the benefit of using these technologies. So what does it mean actually using DNA to test our product? Every plant has got DNA, and this DNA, although might be very similar from one plant to another, you will always have a little hotspot, a little difference that will be characteristic of the plant that we want to study. So in this slide, you see two, we call it a sequence, two line of letters which represent the DNA. And often we have two conserved regions, which are represented here, that are exactly the same for both plant 1 and plant 2. While in the middle, we have a variable region, which when we look at closer and we do what is called an amplification, so we copy this piece of information of DNA, we can find out that there are hotspots that are specific for one plant or specific for another. So these hotspots will give us information about what plant is present in my sample. So if I got T, like in this case, I can assume that this is plant 1. And if I got G, I can assume that is a different plant, in this case called plant 2. Now, when we talk about this technique, often people use the term DNA barcoding because each piece of information of DNA will be characteristic, like a barcode on any product that you buy on the market that will give you more information about that particular product. The way to use this technique can be quite straightforward. We'll have to do a DNA extraction of our product and then copy a lot of time a particular section of our DNA using a technique called PCR, which is quite simple and straightforward to use. And then read the information with a sequencing reaction that when we have a matching sequence with a reference standard will give us the 100% identity of the plant of interest. Now, this three-step process is not actually always linear, but we need to go back and revisit it and optimize it times to time accordingly to the plant that you want to study. If we were working with animal, it would be much easier. Animals have a barcoding region called the CO1. It works very well to differentiate the different animals that might be in a food shop. And this one was used, for instance, it was mentioned before in one of the presentations during the horse meat scandal. So with this piece of the DNA, it's possible to check if inside your burger you have, let's say, cow or horse. Plant have multiple barcoding regions that have been studied and suggested, and sometimes we have to work with more than one of these barcoding regions to be sure that the product is a particular plant or another. So it's not a one size fits all strategy. It's a process that needs to be tailored, but often start with the barcoding as a first step. Then we can look at this hotspot, which in the previous slides were the letter G and T, and design a strategy that suit what we are looking for and help us to differentiate a plant based on this hotspot. We can use a quantitative real-time PCR if you want to quantify the product how much product is adulterated, or we can use other strategy like a high-resolution melting curve if we want to have a yes or no answer and we don't want to go through the process of sequencing. So this is a different strategy. So I'm going to show you very briefly how we use in our lab these techniques. And I'll give you some example of plants, but really can be translated in with different spices, for instance. So we had quite a lot of work going on Tulsi, which is quite popular in India, belongs to the Basilicum family, and we developed a technique to actually be able to differentiate Tulsi from other Basilicum plant looking at the DNA sequencing. We are also doing further study looking at the chemical profile of these plants against the other Basilicum, and that will be published soon. In quite interesting job that we have done a few years ago was on contamination of Aristolochia fungi into Stephania tetandra product. Now, Stephania tetandra is a diuretic, and it was used quite a lot a few years ago for weight loss purpose. Unfortunately, a lot of people start to have a problem in their kidney, and quite a lot of people died as well. When we start to look into what happened, scientists realized that the product that these people unfortunately had consumed didn't contain Stephania tetandra inside, but instead Aristolochia fungi. They are completely different species, but they do share a very similar Chinese name. So somewhere in the supply chain, a mistake happened and a lot of people lost their life because of it. Now, although these products in theory are not on the market anymore, it's still possible to buy them online. So there's still a lot of Stephania tetandra product available on the market. So there's still the need to be able to detect this big and important contamination. So we use a qPCR technique to check if we could detect product contamination from Aristolochia in Stephania, and we managed to develop a method for going down to 2% of contamination. We are doing some other work in helping, for instance, the national collection to be sure that their plant in the national collection are classified as reliable as they should. We found out that in many cases that is not possible, even if that be previously classified by expert on plant classification based on what the plant look like. And we have also done other studies in other plants like Echinacea using their resolution melting curve. So now, recently we become quite interested, like a lot of other people, in peanut contamination, and we are developing a strategy to help the false positive results that often are obtained with fenugreek. Just as a background, there are different peanut protein that are responsible for the allergenic reaction when peanut is consumed. Not all of them are always checked, and some of them are more reliable than others. The issue that we have with fenugreek is that these plants belong to the same family, the legume family of peanut, and so it's possible to have a cross-reactivity of allergens. So basically, doing an ELISA, for instance, I am detecting the presence of a peanut protein, while in reality is something very similar and is a protein that belongs to the fenugreek instead. So we need to be able to confirm these results. We need to be able to be sure that if we get a positive result, is indeed a positive result. But also we need to be sure that if we get a negative result, that is a negative result. And because the DNA of it could get degraded and the protein can get degraded, that's why it's important not to base the results and the testing on only one size section of DNA or only one protein, because we may not detect it, but it doesn't mean it's not there. We have recently been working with some companies about checking the quality of their product. We look at quite a lot of range of different products, and we use the traditional barcoding and sequence strategy to check the quality of these product. And interestingly, some of them didn't have, as they shouldn't, the characteristic peak of the peanuts. So they had a completely different profile that gave us a reassurance that they were not contaminated. We also, though, find out that a particular sample did indeed contain one of the protein that DNA of the protein that is responsible for the issue that we have with peanut. And interesting, that was the same results that the company had when tested their product privately. So we can see that we can design different tests that can confirm or not what is available on the market at the moment in terms of testing. I want to give a few minutes for the final talk. So I'm going to skip some of these slides, but I guess my important point here is that it's important to combine approach and combine testing to be sure that our elements are there or not when a test is performed and the results are given. But it's also important to know what kind of strategy we can suggest to the producer, or we can suggest to the exporter and importer. Nowadays, I hear quite a lot of people talking about next generation sequencing for spice insurance. In my opinion, this is a technique that at the moment should be kept as a primary research technique, because it's very complicated, it's very costly, and is not often possible to use it in an industrial setting. While other DNA technique may be a bit more industry friendly, and they should be used and in industrial setting for checking quality control of product. So just to sum this up, I do think that traditional methods are important. We can still use them, but they're no longer sufficient to work on their own in today's regulatory market demands. We need to have a fit to purpose and tailored molecular testing that go together in parallel with the one already available and used routinely. And I really would like to push the regulatory bodies to give us and give a bit support in encouraging the adoption of a DNA-based authentication method to ensure the quality of our product stays up to the correct standard, as they've done it during the deep diving of the European Commission. So because they use both chemical and also molecular techniques. So why not? Get in touch if you want to know a bit more about this. I know that I have really had to run to finish on time. So please get in touch if you want to have more information, if you want your sample to be tested by us, or if you want to have a chat about what is the best strategy to use in your industry or in your supply chain to test the product that you have. I want to thank you for listening and also thank everyone else that is working with me in the biomolecular technology group, because without them, I would not have been able to present all the information that I show you today. Thank you.
Right. Thank you, Tiziana. So you want to stop sharing?
Yeah.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you. So I appreciate that we are nearing that 1 p.m. slot. So I think before we go on to Q&As, I'm just going to have a quick thank you in terms of all the people who have supported us behind the scenes before we set this out. So Dr. Venkatachalam Murugan, the Consul General of India, Birmingham, has supported us very strongly in setting this up. He's attended, he's on the call right now, and he has taken a very active interest in food sector, food industry. He has a background in that with a PhD. We would like to thank the Ministry of Commerce and Industry, the Spice Board of India, Food Standards Agency of the UK, Trading Standards UK, for helping us in this. De Montfort University for helping us set this up. Of course, Tiziana is from De Montfort, but behind the scenes also they have supported us. And the Indo-British Trade Council, who's been a staunch supporter of the trading between India and the UK. Of course, thank you to the speakers. We're going to come to the questions, but I know some people have to drop off the call. So before that, we just want to set this out. So we'll go on to the question and answers. Ready, Milan, David, and Tiziana? So I'm just going to go through some of the questions that have been asked. First one, because Milan talked about the role of the importers in India and how India is a kind of perhaps a separate entity where they're already doing a lot of testing before the spices come onto the supply chain journey. And then David talked about the controls at the UK end and looking at high risk food and feed not of animal origin and the kind of the regulations around it and the processes around it, etc., for testing. Now, there are a couple of questions from Ayushi Parmar has asked, then Rupi Nandra has asked, similar lines in terms of can the Indian regulators and the UK regulators create a joint framework to guide the importers and exporters, because it seems quite a complicated affair in terms of, if the importers in India are already testing it and the export side of things are finding out that actually there is a problem in terms of contamination, etc. So is there a way we can do some joint things and in line of the FTA coming through in the future? So what do you think, Milan, David, in this case?
I think
anyone go first, not a problem.
Yeah, I think we met with Milan and other colleagues last week, and I think we explored some great ways of working through, and I think Milan highlighted in his presentation of working through GAFTA and the European Spice Association through IOSTA and feeding information that way back into sort of like relevant competent authorities, the Indian Spice Board, people like that. And I think that's a great way, and I think it's something we need to explore. So I think, we have information about what's on our watch list, what's on our national monitoring plan. We know what we're thinking of putting into Annex 1, Annex 2, what we want to take out of control. And the more information that we can reach out to and be provided by those competent authorities in relevant countries, the better. And equally, we realise that this would be a fantastic route to feed information about what we're concerned about as well in country and to receive feedback. So yeah, I think we are beginning to see that. I would like to point out that every year we do try to reach out to relevant competent authorities in countries to get this information. It's not always possible. Everybody's busy doing things, but I think this looks to be an exciting route in from it.
Milan?
Yes, look, I think joining up regulators is not a problem. We're collaborating, industry and regulator collaborating in the UK, and that means that will flow all the way back down to India. But I don't see that as the big problem. Firstly, regulation is necessary friction in international trade. Yep, and it affects agri-produce as much as anything else, because we choose that we don't have completely libertarian free trade. We have a regulated environment in which we allow our regulators to check on us and check that we're doing what we should be doing. So in that scenario, the two issues that I think we have to tackle are not really about joining up regulators.
Mm-hmm.
To the extent that we are joining up regulators, we could bake that into a free trade agreement. There's a few things we could do in a free trade agreement. There's tariffs and non-tariff barrier to trade issues that happy to discuss on a free trade agreement. I think the practical issues are we've got those importers that need to up their standards. We really need to help them and coach them and bring them up to standard. And then we're not going to get a lot of the issues that are coming into the UK. And secondly, it's a notorious minefield on lab testing. Because as you've seen, international trade works on certainty, and yet you have the uncertainty of not being able to rely on lab certificates. Yep. And that brings a whole degree of complexity into it. Nothing to do with the regulator. Obviously, we want our regulators to be pragmatic and not trigger happy. So when they see a certificate saying there's an issue, they don't leap to a product recall, as they might have 20 years ago. Look, our regulators have all learnt from that, and they look at things in context. So in general, I'm quite satisfied that we're all working hard on the areas that need attention.
Perhaps we need a little bit more information dissemination at both ends of how to manage it as best practice, isn't it? Because it may not, regulatory is a process, but then there's also the proactive scenarios that we would do to try and get the burden off the regulators. If it's not so, CTPAT or those kind of scenarios where there's a lot more inward regulation control internally before a journey starts. Thank you for that. I'm just going to go to Tiziana. There are two questions. One was about the DNA barcoding. You've talked about the whole testing process and how do you tackle certain products and processes in there. Where does that come into the context? So when we've talked about the import, say if it's an India side of the importer side of things, is it coming at that end in a more proactive way, or is it coming at the exporter side where they are, the import side of the UK and the export side of it? So if the exporters in India are doing the testing, would you say the DNA barcoding goes there first, or do you saying it's coming at the import side? And then there's somebody else asked a question around that, is why this is not, I'm not in that science part, but why are IRMS, which I think you understand, stable isotopes, was not included in the study among all the other tests? There are two parts of the question.
Okay, so let's start with the first part. So it does depend on, I guess, how much you trust the people that are sending your product to start with. If you have a very good relationship with the people that you're buying your product for, you probably can have them checking for any contamination. Although, as we say, it is a long process. It could happen in other steps during the supply chain. Personally, I would probably test my sample before they enter in my building if I am an importer, just so that I know that up to there everything is correct. I know my how I work inside my building, so I'm sure that the product that I will deliver will be of the quality that I want to represent. The DNA doesn't get, it does get degraded, but not on the extent that you can't use it or you can't test it later on, like after you have treated your product with heat or with other decontamination methods. So it can be done at the very last point of your chain, and it will still give you good results in terms of quality control. Now, the second question was about Samir.
The IRMS stable isotopes, why was that not used in the testing?
I don't really know the answer of that. I just had a look at what I suppose that you are referring to the European Commission. There were probably other tests that they should and they may have done, but the one that I reported is probably like a fraction of them. We're talking about 10,000 testing. So I just reported the one that are more in line with the adulteration and contamination of the product, but they could have done also other tests in terms of presence of microbial microbes or other testing around other things. So these are just the one that I selected to show you the case of test that needs to be done, and that needs to be done accordingly to what you want to find out is present inside your sample.
Okay, thank you so much for that. So I think, of course, people are dropping off, so we'll get the last 2-3 questions very quickly. One question is around FSA, and this is for David, I guess. There are public consultations that the FSA conducts for high-risk food and feed not of animal origin, and the frequency is annual. But this person says that the EU completes the review every 6 months. So what is your take on that? Would we go 6 months or would we stay as annual?
We're required under legislation to review every 6 months. We endeavour to try and do that. Unfortunately, because of the way we've retained EU law, it probably protracts the way that we bring in the SI. So it probably doesn't really work out every 6 months, but we do review every 6 months. There is a current consultation out, and again, I would just just urge members, people on the call, really do respond, provide evidence to that consultation. It is genuinely looked at, and we have made reverse decisions on information that's been provided through previous consultations. So if you've got any information, please do share it with us.
Okay. Thank you. Milan, for you, there's a long question. I'm not going to read the whole question, but just so shouldn't the supplier also ensure that the allergen statement, including the allergens and nut policy, is shared during export at the port? And technically, with all the different lines of preparation, etc., how would somebody manage that risk properly?
Right. So the allergen risk is slightly different. So somebody like David is probably, and maybe I can ask David, but he's not so much looking out for allergens. Is that the case? Because that's not a official control.
No, that's right. It's picked up by other means. Yes.
Yeah. So exactly. So the point is, with the allergens, it's a labeling issue, and if we're not expecting to find allergens in our food, then we've got to have risk management processes down the supply chain that give us due diligence. So, for example, firstly, look, I can only explain how we do it, and it works to an extent. There'll be people doing it better, and I'd like to learn from them. What we do is we firstly have a risk map for each product that we're buying, and that risk map will be per supplier. So the haldi that I'm buying from one supplier and the haldi I'm buying from another supplier will grow in different areas, so their risk maps will be different. But then that risk map is a document. Physically going to Tamil Nadu and walking from, following the route that haldi takes, looking at where it grows, looking at what's the field next door, is it growing an allergen? These are all the issues. Because where does allergen contamination come in? Let's look at history. What are the instances? When we've done the root cause analysis, it's somebody has used a bag that was used for sesame, turned it inside out, used it for chili, turned it inside out again, and used it for some other spice. And then you're getting trace level, because remember, we're testing at parts per million or sometimes parts per billion. So you're getting trace level contamination. The truck that takes the spices from the field to the market. So that's why what we try and do with our suppliers is control every aspect from cultivation onwards. And I think those are the ways you do it. Then in the factory you have control. So most, you want your factories to be free of certain allergens, and that's fine. You choose your processes accordingly, but really it's cultivation onwards. And then the testing is where, again, you have to think, are you testing for the protein or are you testing for the DNA? And those, historically, people used to test for protein, and they used to use these ELISA-based tests that are great. They give you a quantification, but you get a lot of false positives. And we did an exercise where, some years ago, we did an exercise where literally for 6 months, every single spice that came from India, on arrival, we tested it by this ELISA method. And every time we got a positive, we sent it for a PCR test, which is a DNA-based test. PCR, you remember from COVID, is a sort of amplification of DNA. And they came out clear. There was nothing there. And then we retested and retested just to make sure. There was nothing there, but you get these false positives. And if you act on these false positives, and I would really urge our regulators to be circumspect in how they look at lab results, but if you act on false positives, you've got needless product recalls going on. Yep. So, but allergens is all about risk management and vigilance.
My question on this is why we are not actually looking for the presence of peanut instead of looking at the presence of peanut protein, which is more prone to be degraded than peanut DNA. So it would be easier because I guess it will probably pick up a few more product that tested negative before, just because the protein is not detected. It doesn't mean that the plant might not have been in contact with peanut.
Diana, you're absolutely right. And in fact, a lot of the testing now is PCR based. That's the first default. You know, sometimes you have one test, then you switch to another, or you have validated like LCMS, or the industry is grappling with these issues, and it always is evolving. And certainly your input would be very useful on this.
Yeah. So I think we should try and end this call now because we've already got 10 minutes above the 1 p.m. Just as a kind of passing thought, because there was a question on LinkedIn for us, they're saying that, okay, we've talked about trading between countries, etc. But in the UK, this is mentioned in that question, that in the UK, there is a lot of local issues around contamination and around processing of spices in the local mills. So perhaps FSA has, or trading standards has something to do with that, if not the export side, import side of things, but local regulatory scenarios around testing, etc., for what's happening manufactured in the UK rather than just imported. Anything on that, David? Anything about local?
Yeah, I mean, the requirements that we set out for for those manufacturers abroad are the same requirements here. So we expect the same standards. Our local authorities, trading standards people, they do things, they inspect on a risk basis. The requirement is for the food business operator to do the right thing and to follow the requirements. We can't, our inspectors can't be everywhere from it, but yes, I mean, the requirement is that you do the right thing here. And yes, I don't think there's really more I can say there, Professor. Yeah.
Sorry,
there's not a lot more I can say, really. It's we deal with imports, but I'm not expert on our local delivery.
That's fine. That's fine. It's just somebody's raised a question that same controls will happen internally anyway, in terms of, because we have got more avenues for the last mile delivery of spices now, rather than the standard shells. It can come from any source. So it's just, but that's fine. This was just a part of that. So I think we'll end the session. Thank you very much, all the speakers. Tiziana, David, Milan, is good. There's been a lot of chat. You could go back to this session on Teams and check the chat. It's all good messages about how people have learned and they find it really useful. I think as a part of this post, we should organize more sessions like this. Perhaps some physical, should be a conference between Indian and UK regulators with the industry involved, to try and bridge any of those scenarios. Perhaps we also do some exchange of regulators, through delegations to India and vice versa to the UK. So there is a lot we can kind of set up. This is just the start, I would say, set up for the future. So thank you very much, everybody who's on the call.
Thank you, everyone.
Still after 15 minutes after the 1 p.m. slot. So you're really dedicated and committed. I know other people have sent messages. They had to go into other meetings. So thank you very much for staying with us and attending the session. And we'll end. So Tiziana, we can end this session.
Thank you very much.
Bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you.